That's it for the peace agreement. This is sensational material. Sensational.
And we are observing that it's being very intensively discussed. I'm not claiming that it will be approved, but the European Union is already losing its breath when it comes to financing Ukraine's military needs. Everyone's had enough. Everyone sees that the strategy to destroy Russia failed. So suddenly a deal is on the table. Let's bring Russia back into the group of nations that are superpowers and will play an even more important role. If this plan is signed, Russia will emerge from this war as a total victor, and Russia will, of course, emerge from this war extraordinarily strengthened, both morally and economically. First, ladies and gentlemen, I want to stress that a plan as serious as this one cannot be realized without Ukraine's consent. Let's be absolutely clear on this. If something is on paper and it has 28 points, and this primarily concerns Ukraine, it is not possible to dictate to any member state that they must accept it. Therefore, the first fundamental condition for the realization of this enormous plan is the consent of Ukraine. Secondly, I would have liked to see more active role for the European Union, because the plan includes, for example, 100 billion euros the Union should use for Ukraine's reconstruction. But apart from that, we see absolutely nothing that would involve the European Union in the discussion. I won't comment now on why that is the case. You already know my opinion. The foreign policy of the European Union is simply non-existent. It also seems that the respect of major global players for the European Union is very small. And that is probably also the reason why the European Union itself did not get to the negotiating table and was not part of the preparation and creation of these extremely serious conditions of the peace agreement. Remember when I said that the fundamental prerequisite for a peace agreement is an agreement that Ukraine will not be a NATO member state? You all gasped here. The entire government office groaned. You could be heard in every space and in every room. And all of a sudden, everyone today just takes this completely for granted. When we were explaining that it simply wouldn't be possible to finalize any peace agreement without some territorial losses for Ukraine, well, then you all just groaned and complained so much. All of this resonated here. Yet today, none of you are saying that essentially it's like that because this peace treaty, which is now on the table, speaks of such grave and serious breaches of Ukraine's territorial integrity that no one could have ever even dreamed of. In this agreement, Ukraine's position is 100 times worse than it was in April of 2022. Who will acknowledge this among those war hawks in the European Union after they so strongly supported that war? When they so fiercely sent those weapons? When they so vehemently forbade any ceasefire? Who today will admit as your fault and say, yes, we let them kill since 1922 and hundreds of thousands of people died for what? I presume you had the strength to read the draft peace agreement, which is probably the only possible and truly realistic one. But you all, every single one of you here, supported that war. Anyone who dared to speak of peace was immediately branded a traitor. You encouraged rioting on the sidewalks, all sorts of utter foolishness, and I will continue to bring this question up again and again. Ladies and gentlemen, and most importantly, I'm going to ask, first of all, Europe has sent 177 billion euros to Ukraine throughout the duration of this war. How much of that did the Ukrainians steal?
How much of it was subject to corrupt dealings?
Now, Europe is again asked to find another 140 billion for the next 2 years. Do we have an obligation to send more money to Ukraine if we know about huge corruption scandals in this country and have no idea how much of those 177 billion euros ended up in private pockets? I want to remind you that as Prime Minister, I will not support any legal or legitimate mechanisms that would lead to the confiscation of frozen Russian assets, because this raises enormous legal doubts. It raises possibilities of arbitration, but above all, it raises possibilities of enormous retaliation from the Russian Federation against assets that any European Union member state may hold on Russian territory. And above all, the Belgian Prime Minister knows this very well because Belgium is the country where these financial assets are managed. Therefore, allow me to repeat for the Slovak public, as not everyone can see everything immediately, the conditions the Americans are proposing as a peace agreement. Firstly, Ukraine will never join NATO. How much you screamed, okay, what a traitor I am for claiming Ukraine cannot join NATO. But today the United States says that, so naturally you're all silent. NATO must not be allowed to expand any further. Listen very carefully. NATO must not be allowed to expand any further. How much did you all protest when I stated that Russia had been deceived by NATO's expansion? And that was indeed one of the primary reasons why these military activities took place.
That's it for the peace agreement. This is sensational material. Sensational.
And we are observing that it's being very intensively discussed. I'm not claiming that it will be approved, but the European Union is already losing its breath when it comes to financing Ukraine's military needs. Everyone's had enough. Everyone sees that the strategy to destroy Russia failed. So suddenly a deal is on the table. Let's bring Russia back into the group of nations that are superpowers and will play an even more important role. If this plan is signed, Russia will emerge from this war as a total victor, and Russia will, of course, emerge from this war extraordinarily strengthened, both morally and economically.
They mentioned a peace plan for Ukraine, so how do you perceive yesterday's statements by Mr. Melechar, the State Secretary of the Ministry of Defense, that Ukraine should be under Russian control?
Am I allowed to say, or am I not allowed to say, that Ukraine was under total American influence? Am I allowed to say that, or is that forbidden as well? Well, that's simply a fact. When you went to the Ministry of Defense, you found primarily American military advisors there. When you went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you found American advisors there. Yes. Prior to the Maidan in 2014, the Russian political establishment exerted a rather strong influence on Ukraine. It certainly did. And we argue that had a peace agreement been signed in April of 2022, Ukraine would have retained 100 times more than it will if this current peace agreement is eventually signed.